Let me set the stage for you. My name's Jack, and for the last 15 years, I thought I had it all. I married Melanie, my college sweetheart, and we built a life together that most people would envy. We've got 2 kids, Amy and Jake, who mean the world to me. We live in a cozy suburban home, the kind you see in those family sitcoms where everything looks perfect. And for a while, I believed we were that picture-perfect family. Melanie and I met in college, back when life was simpler and the biggest worry was passing exams. She was everything I ever wanted in a woman: smart, funny, beautiful, and ambitious. We clicked right away, and it wasn't long before we were inseparable. We did everything together, and I was convinced we were destined to be one of those couples who grow old together, hand in hand. After college, we got married, had kids, and settled into what seemed like an ideal life. I got a stable job in IT, and Melanie stayed home to raise the kids. We were a team, or so I thought. Our roles were clear: she took care of the house and the kids, and I made sure we were financially secure. For years, this arrangement worked, and I never doubted it. I never doubted her. But things started changing a few months ago. At first, it was subtle little things that didn't quite add up but that I brushed off because I didn't want to overthink them. Melanie began going out more often, saying she needed time to herself, to catch up with old friends, or to work on a new hobby she picked up: photography. I was supportive, even proud that she was finding new interests now that the kids were older and more independent. Then came the late nights. She'd come home after I'd already gone to bed, always with a ready excuse about losing track of time or having a drink too many with her friends. I didn't push her, didn't pry, because I trusted her completely. She was my wife, the mother of my children, and I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Sure, our sex life had dwindled, but that happens to everyone after a decade and a half of marriage, right? It didn't worry me too much. We were comfortable, settled in our routines. I figured it was just a phase, something we'd eventually work through. But then, the distance between us started to grow. Melanie became more irritable, snapping at me over little things that never used to bother her. I tried to talk to her about it, to see if something was bothering her, but she brushed me off every time. "I'm just tired, Jack. You're reading too much into it," she'd say, with that dismissive tone that made me feel like I was the one overreacting. And so, I let it go, each time convincing myself that it was nothing, that we were just going through a rough patch. But the rough patch didn't end. Instead, it got worse. I'd catch her smiling at her phone, a smile I hadn't seen in a long time, one that used to be reserved for me. When I asked who she was texting, she'd tell me it was just a friend, no one I knew. And again, I believed her, because why wouldn't I? But there was one incident that planted the first real seed of doubt in my mind. It was about a month ago. We were at a party, and Melanie disappeared for a while. When she came back, she looked flustered, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. I asked her where she'd been, and she got defensive, said she just needed some air. I let it go, not wanting to cause a scene, but the nagging feeling in my gut didn't go away. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Melanie would never do anything to hurt me or our family. But that feeling in my gut kept growing, and I couldn't shake it. I started paying more attention, looking for signs that something was off. And the more I looked, the more I found. Melanie started taking more care with her appearance, dressing up even when she had nowhere special to go. She was secretive about her phone, always keeping it close, and if I asked to use it for something, she'd make some excuse. The late nights continued, and she always had a reason: book club, a girls' night out, even a photography meetup. One night, I decided to stay up and wait for her to come home. It was past midnight when she finally walked through the door, smelling of alcohol and something else I couldn't quite place. She looked surprised to see me sitting in the living room, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes: guilt, maybe, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by irritation. "Why are you still up?" she asked, like I was the one doing something wrong. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I was worried about you." "There's nothing to worry about, Jack. I was just out with the girls." "Go to bed," she said, brushing past me without so much as a goodnight kiss. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the doubts I'd been trying to ignore came crashing down on me. Something was definitely wrong, and I needed to find out what it was. But how do you confront the woman you've loved for half your life about something you can't even prove? How do you ask the person you trust most in the world if they're betraying you? I wasn't ready to face the answers to those questions. So, I buried them, hoping that I was just being paranoid, that everything would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Something had changed, and I had no idea how to fix it. Looking back, I realize I was naive, too trusting, too willing to believe that our life was as perfect as it seemed. I should have seen the signs earlier, should have paid more attention. But I didn't, and now here I am, on the verge of discovering a truth I'm not sure I'm prepared to handle. This is just the beginning of my story, the calm before the storm, before everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my wife would be turned upside down. The weeks that followed were torture. Every night, the gnawing suspicion in my gut grew stronger, and every time I looked at Melanie, I felt that gnawing suspicion gnash at my insides. I had to know for sure if she was cheating on me, but I wasn't sure how to find out without tipping her off. But then, one night, I got my answer in the most unexpected way. It was a Friday evening, and Melanie told me she was going out with her girlfriends again. This time, though, something felt off. There was a certain eagerness in her voice that set off alarm bells in my head. She spent extra time getting ready, putting on makeup and wearing a dress that she hadn't worn in years. It was one of those dresses that used to be reserved for special occasions, nights where we'd go out to a fancy dinner or celebrate something important. Seeing her in it again, with her hair done just right and perfume lingering in the air, made me realize that she wasn't dressing up for just any night out with the girls. She left the house with a smile, telling me not to wait up, and I watched her walk out the door. The kids were spending the night at my parents', so I was alone with nothing but my thoughts and the gnawing suspicion that tonight was the night she'd cross a line she couldn't come back from. I tried to distract myself, but my mind kept going back to her, to what she was doing, to who she was really meeting. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, got in the car, and started driving. I didn't have a plan, didn't know where to go, but something inside me was pushing me forward, guiding me. I drove aimlessly for a while, not sure where Melanie would be or who she would be with. But then, as I turned a corner near the downtown area, I saw her car parked outside a small, dimly lit bar. I pulled over, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to believe what I was about to do, but I knew I had to. I walked up to the bar, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. Inside, the place was dim and crowded, the kind of place where people go to get lost in the music and forget their problems. I scanned the room, searching for her, and then I saw Melanie, sitting at a table in the back with a man I didn't recognize. He was younger than me, maybe by 10 years, with the kind of rugged good looks that women seem to fall for. He was leaning in close to her, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard in years. The sight of them together, so comfortable, so intimate, made my blood boil. I felt like I was seeing red, my vision tunneling as anger surged through me. I moved toward them, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. They didn't see me coming until I was right in front of their table. Melanie looked up, her eyes wide with shock and fear. The man, her lover, looked up too, his face morphing from surprise to a smug grin that made my blood boil even hotter. "Jack?" Melanie stammered, her voice shaking. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer her. I couldn't. All I could do was stare at the man sitting across from her, the man who had been touching what was mine, who had been sharing private moments with my wife. He had the audacity to smile at me, like this was all some kind of game. That was when something in me snapped. Without thinking, I reached across the table and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, yanking him out of his seat and slamming him against the wall. The impact sent a few drinks crashing to the floor, and suddenly, the whole bar went quiet, all eyes on us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, feel the raw fury coursing through my veins as I stared into his eyes, which now held a flicker of fear. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I growled, my voice low and menacing. I didn't wait for him to answer. My fist connected with his jaw before he could say a word, the force of the punch sending a shockwave of pain through my knuckles and making his head snap back against the wall. He grunted in pain, but he didn't go down. Instead, he tried to shove me off, his hands pushing against my chest as he struggled to regain his footing. But I wasn't going to let him get away that easily. I grabbed him again, this time by the back of the neck, and drove my knee into his gut. He doubled over, gasping for air, but I didn't stop. I was relentless, landing blow after blow, my fists pounding into his face and body with a ferocity I didn't know I was capable of. Melanie was screaming, begging me to stop, but I barely heard her. All I could focus on was the man in front of me, the man who had been fucking my wife. I didn't care that we were in a public place, didn't care that everyone was watching. I wanted to hurt him, to make him feel the pain that I had been carrying inside me for weeks. He tried to fight back, landing a weak punch on my side, but it barely registered. I grabbed him by the shirt again, slamming him against the wall once more, and this time I didn't hold back. My fist connected with his nose, and I felt the bone crack under the impact. Blood spurted out, splattering across my knuckles and his face. He groaned in pain, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. "Jack, please stop." Melanie screamed, trying to pull me off him, but I shook her off. I wasn't done with him yet. I grabbed a handful of his hair and pulled his head back, forcing him to look at me. "You think you can just take what's mine?" I spat, my voice trembling with rage. "You think you can just fuck my wife and get away with it?" His eyes were wide with fear now, blood dripping down his face as he struggled to speak. "Man, I didn't know she was married." "Shut the fuck up," I roared, cutting him off. "I don't give a shit what you knew. You're going to pay for this." I drew my fist back, ready to hit him again, but suddenly, I felt hands grabbing me, pulling me away. It took a moment for me to realize that two bouncers had grabbed me, dragging me away from him. I struggled against them, trying to get back to him, but they were stronger than me, and they managed to pull me away. "Let go of me," I shouted, trying to break free, but they wouldn't. They dragged me out of the bar, Melanie following close behind, pleading with them to let me go. They dumped me outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I was still breathing hard, my fists clenched, as I turned to face Melanie. She looked terrified, tears streaming down her face as she reached out to me. "Jack, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." "Save it," I snapped, my voice cold. "I don't want to hear your fucking excuses. I saw enough." I could see the fear in her eyes, see the realization that she had finally been caught, that there was no way out of this. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the rage inside me was too strong, too consuming. I couldn't stand to look at her, couldn't stand to be near her. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, sobbing in the street. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I knew was that everything I thought I knew about my life was gone, shattered in an instant by the betrayal of the woman I loved. As I walked away, the adrenaline started to wear off, and the pain in my knuckles and ribs set in. But that pain was nothing compared to the pain in my chest, the pain of knowing that my marriage was a lie, that the woman I had trusted with my heart had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I didn't get far before the adrenaline started to wear off, leaving me with a mix of physical pain and emotional devastation. My knuckles throbbed, bloodied from pounding that bastard's face, and my ribs ached from the 1 or 2 hits he managed to land. But none of that compared to the pain gnawing at my insides, the agony of betrayal that made it hard to even think straight. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I didn't want to be anywhere near Melanie, and I definitely didn't want to stick around to face the aftermath of what I'd just done. I could still see her tear-streaked face in my mind, her eyes wide with fear as she tried to pull me off her lover. A part of me felt a sick satisfaction in knowing I'd scared her, in knowing that she was finally paying for what she'd done. But another part of me was terrified of what this all meant for us, for our family, for everything we'd built together. I was halfway down the street when I heard the sirens. My stomach dropped, a cold realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. The fight in the bar hadn't gone unnoticed, and now the cops were coming. I knew I was in trouble, real trouble. And as much as I wanted to keep running, I knew there was no escaping what was coming next. I turned to see the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the buildings, getting closer and closer. My mind raced, thinking of what to do, what to say. But before I could even form a plan, the squad car pulled up beside me, and 2 officers jumped out, their hands already on their holsters. "Stop right there," one of them shouted, his voice commanding. "Put your hands where I can see them." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I raised my hands, palms out, trying to show them that I wasn't a threat. My mind was still reeling from the fight, from everything that had just happened. I couldn't believe this was my life now, standing in the middle of the street with the cops coming for me. The officers approached cautiously, their eyes darting between me and the bar where the fight had gone down. "You Jack Miller?" one of them asked, his voice hard and suspicious. "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaky. "That's me." "Turn around, Jack," the officer said. "Put your hands on the car." I hesitated for a second, but I knew better than to argue. Slowly, I turned around and placed my hands on the cold metal of the police car, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The officer patted me down, checking for weapons or anything else, while his partner stood watch, ready to act if I made any sudden moves. "Is this about the fight?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You could say that," the officer replied, his tone flat. He finished his search, then stepped back. "You're under arrest for assault, Jack." Hearing those words made my stomach churn. I knew I'd crossed a line in that bar, but hearing it said out loud, hearing the word arrest, made it all too real. "He was sleeping with my wife," I blurted out, not sure if it would make any difference. "I caught them together, I just lost it." The officer didn't seem moved by my explanation. "You can tell that to the judge," he said coldly, as he reached for his handcuffs. But before he could cuff me, another car pulled up. This one wasn't a cop car. It was Melanie's. She jumped out, her face pale and drawn, and ran over to the officers. "Wait. Wait, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Don't arrest him, please, it's my fault, all of this is my fault." The officer glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, you need to step back," he said, his tone firm. "We're handling this." "No, you don't understand," Melanie cried, tears streaming down her face. "It was my fault, I was the one who messed up. Jack's not a violent man, he's never done anything like this before, he just lost control because of what I did. Please, don't take him away. Don't do this to our family." I could see the desperation in her eyes, see how terrified she was of what was happening. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. This was the same woman who had been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, betraying me. Now she was trying to play the concerned wife, trying to save me from the consequences of what I'd done. But it was too late for that. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," the officer said, holding up a hand to stop her from getting any closer. "You can explain everything at the station. Right now, we need to take your husband into custody." "Please," Melanie sobbed, falling to her knees in front of them. "Don't do this, I'm begging you. I'll do anything, just don't arrest him." The officer sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the scene she was making. He exchanged a glance with his partner, who shrugged slightly, as if to say, "What do we do now?" Finally, the first officer looked back at me, his eyes narrowing. "All right, here's what we're going to do," he said slowly. "You're coming down to the station with us, Jack. But we're not going to cuff you. You'll ride in the back, and we'll sort this out there." I nodded numbly, too drained to argue or fight. All I wanted was for this nightmare to be over, for everything to just stop. The officer gestured for me to get in the car, and I did as he said, sliding into the back seat. As the door closed behind me, I saw Melanie standing there, watching, her face streaked with tears. I didn't know what to feel anymore, anger, sadness, betrayal, it was all too much. The ride to the station was a blur. I stared out the window, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making any sense. The weight of what I'd done, of what Melanie had done, pressed down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't believe this was my life now, that everything had come crashing down so quickly. When we arrived at the station, the officers led me inside. They processed me, took my fingerprints, and asked me a few questions, standard procedure, I guessed. I answered in a daze, still trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened. They didn't throw me in a cell, though. Instead, they put me in a small interrogation room and told me to wait. I had no idea what was going to happen next. I sat there, staring at the table in front of me, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The fight, the blood, Melanie's tear-streaked face, it was like a movie I couldn't turn off, no matter how much I wanted to. I kept wondering if I could have done something differently, if I could have stopped myself before it got to this point. But the truth was, in that moment, I didn't care. All I wanted was to make that man pay for what he'd done, for what Melanie had done. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and an officer stepped in. He wasn't one of the ones who had arrested me. This guy was older, with graying hair and a tired look in his eyes. He sat down across from me, placing a file on the table. "Jack, my name's Detective Harris," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I've been going over the details of what happened tonight. I know you're in a tough spot, and I'm here to help you sort this out." I nodded, not sure what to say. My throat felt dry, and my head was pounding. "Listen, I get it," Harris continued. "You caught your wife with another man, and you lost control. Happens more often than you'd think. But you need to understand, you can't take matters into your own hands like that. What you did tonight, it's serious. Assault is a crime, no matter the circumstances." "I know," I mumbled, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. I didn't know what else to do." Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'm going to level with you, Jack. Melanie's been talking to us, and she's willing to cooperate. She's told us everything, including how she provoked you, how she's been seeing this guy behind your back. We're not unsympathetic to your situation. But you've still got to answer for what happened tonight." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat. "What's going to happen to me?" "Well, that depends," Harris said carefully. "The guy you beat up, he's not pressing charges, at least not yet. He might change his mind later, but for now, he's keeping quiet. That works in your favor. And Melanie's going to bat for you too, saying you're a good man who just snapped under the pressure. She's even offered to cover any medical costs for the guy's injuries." I looked up at him, surprised. She's doing that?" Harris nodded. "Yeah, she is. I think she realizes how much she messed up, and she's trying to make it right, at least in some way. But here's the deal, you'll need to go through the legal process. You'll probably have to appear in court, maybe pay a fine, and there could be other consequences. But it's better than what could have happened if this guy had pressed charges." I sat there, processing what he was saying. It felt like my life was hanging by a thread, and I wasn't sure if that thread was going to hold. "I just want this to be over," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I know, Jack." "I know," Harris said, his voice softening. "But you've got to keep it together. You've got a family to think about, and you need to be there for them. Going forward, you've got to find a way to deal with this anger, with the betrayal. Don't let it ruin your life." I nodded, feeling a mixture of shame and exhaustion wash over me. I knew he was right, but I didn't know how to move forward from here. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. My life, my marriage, everything had been torn apart, and now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. After a few more minutes of talking, Harris stood up and led me out of the room. Melanie was waiting for me in the lobby, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked like she was barely holding it together, like she was on the verge of falling apart. I didn't know what to say to her, didn't know how to feel. I just wanted to go home, to crawl into bed and pretend this whole nightmare had never happened. But I knew that was impossible. The only way out was through, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to face what was coming next. The officers let me go with a warning, telling me to stay out of trouble and to make sure I showed up for any court dates. I agreed, not even fully hearing their words, too lost in my own thoughts. As we left the station, Melanie reached out to take my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't bring myself to touch her, not after everything that had happened. She looked hurt, but she didn't say anything. We walked to the car in silence, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy between us. When we got in, I stared straight ahead, my mind racing with everything that had transpired. Melanie started the car and began driving home, but I couldn't focus on the road or anything around me. All I could think about was the mess my life had become, the mess that we had to somehow untangle, if that was even possible. As we drove through the quiet streets, the reality of what was waiting for us at home settled in. The kids were at my parents', and we'd have to face them eventually, explain what had happened, figure out how to move forward. But for now, the only thing I could do was try to breathe, try to hold myself together long enough to make it through the night. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Melanie turned off the car but didn't make a move to get out. She sat there, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to argue, to yell, or to cry. I just wanted to get inside, to shut everything out and be alone. "Please," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. Can we talk? Can we try to figure this out?" I looked at her, seeing the desperation in her eyes, but all I felt was emptiness. Whatever love I had for her had been buried under a mountain of anger, betrayal, and pain. I didn't know if we could fix this, didn't know if I even wanted to try. "I don't know, Melanie," I finally said, my voice flat. "I don't know if there's anything left to figure out." With that, I got out of the car and walked toward the house, leaving her sitting there in the driveway, crying into her hands. The weight of everything hung over me like a dark cloud, and I knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The days after that night were a blur of numbness and disbelief. The kind of numbness that comes when your world shatters, and you're left trying to piece together what little remains of the life you once knew. Melanie and I didn't speak much. We'd pass each other in the house, like ghosts haunting the remnants of a marriage that no longer existed. I stayed in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of sleeping next to her, of being close to the woman who had betrayed me so completely. But in that silence, something dark and twisted began to fester inside me. The anger I'd unleashed on her lover in that bar hadn't just disappeared, it had settled deep within me, growing stronger with each passing day. I was angry at him, yes, but more than that, I was furious with her, with Melanie, the woman I had loved and trusted, the woman who had destroyed our marriage and our family. I found myself replaying that night over and over in my mind, wondering how she could do this to me, to our children, to everything we'd built together. And with each replay, the anger inside me grew, feeding off the betrayal, the lies, and the pain. I knew I had to do something to make her feel the hurt she had caused me. I couldn't just let her get away with it, couldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. I started to plot my revenge, thinking of ways to make her pay for what she had done. It wasn't enough that she was sorry, or that she was trying to make things right. I wanted her to suffer, to feel the same kind of pain and humiliation that I had felt. And so, I began to plan, calculating every move, every word, every action that would bring her to her knees. The first thing I did was to take control of our finances. I worked in IT, so it wasn't difficult to access our bank accounts, credit cards, and everything else that tied us together financially. I moved half of our savings into a separate account that she couldn't touch and started monitoring every transaction she made. I didn't tell her about it, of course. I wanted her to think that everything was still under her control. But the truth was, I was slowly cutting her off from the life she'd grown accustomed to. Next, I started gathering evidence of her affair. I knew that in a divorce, proof of infidelity could tip things in my favor, especially when it came to custody of the kids. So, I dug through her phone, her emails, her social media accounts, finding every incriminating message, every photo, every bit of proof that she had been cheating on me. I saved it all, building a case against her that I could use when the time was right. But the real revenge came when I decided to hit her where it would hurt the most, her reputation. Melanie had always cared deeply about how others saw her. She prided herself on being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the woman who had it all together. So, I started leaking little bits of information, just enough to plant the seeds of doubt in the minds of our friends, our family, and everyone who thought they knew her. I began with her closest friends, women she had known for years, women who thought she could do no wrong. I'd run into them at the grocery store or at school events, and I'd casually mention how hard things had been at home lately, how Melanie seemed so distant, so preoccupied. I'd drop hints about her late nights out, about how she'd been spending more time away from the family, how she seemed to have changed. I didn't say too much, just enough to make them wonder, to make them start questioning the image she had worked so hard to maintain. And then, when the rumors started to spread, I made sure they had more to talk about. I'd leave her phone out, unlocked, where I knew she'd see it, and I'd make sure that the incriminating messages from her lover were easy to find. I knew she'd read them, and when she did, she'd panic, trying to delete them before anyone else could see. But it was too late, the damage had already been done. Our friends started to pull away from her, their smiles more forced, their invitations less frequent. I knew they were talking about her behind her back, speculating about what was really going on in our marriage. And Melanie knew it too. She started to look more and more stressed, her confident facade cracking under the weight of the rumors and the whispers. She'd try to act like everything was fine, but I could see the strain in her eyes, the way she'd flinch whenever her phone buzzed with a new message or a call she didn't want to answer. The final blow came when I decided to confront her publicly. It was at a dinner party, one of those events where everyone puts on their best clothes and pretends that their lives are perfect. Melanie had begged me to go with her, probably hoping that if we showed up together, it would quash the rumors that were swirling around us. I agreed, but only because I knew this was my chance to deliver the final, crushing blow. We arrived at the party, and for the first hour or so, I played the part of the dutiful husband. I smiled, made small talk, and pretended that everything was fine. But inside, I was seething, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, as we sat down for dinner, surrounded by people who had known us for years, I decided it was time. I stood up, raising my glass as if I were about to make a toast. Everyone quieted down, turning their attention to me, expecting some kind of speech. Melanie looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion and a hint of fear. She had no idea what was coming. "I'd like to make a toast," I began, my voice calm and steady. "To my wife, Melanie. The woman who has been by my side for 15 years, the mother of my children, and the love of my life." I paused, watching as Melanie's face softened with relief. She probably thought I was going to say something sweet, something to reassure her that everything was okay. But she was wrong, so very wrong. "But there's something you all should know," I continued, my tone shifting, becoming colder, harder. "Something that Melanie hasn't been telling you. Something that I think it's time everyone heard." The room went silent, everyone's eyes now fixed on me, waiting to hear what I was going to say. Melanie's face had gone pale, and I could see the panic starting to set in. She knew what was coming, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. "You see, Melanie has been lying to all of us," I said, my voice dripping with contempt. "She's been sneaking around, seeing someone else behind my back, betraying me and our family. For months, maybe even longer, she's been carrying on an affair, and she's been lying to everyone about it. And I think it's time she answers for that." The shock in the room was palpable. I could see our friends exchanging glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. Melanie tried to stand up, tried to say something, but her voice faltered, and she sat back down, her hands trembling. "I've got the proof," I said, pulling out my phone and holding it up for everyone to see. "All the texts, the emails, the photos, it's all here. If any of you want to see what kind of person Melanie really is, just let me know. I'm more than happy to share." I could see the horror in Melanie's eyes, the realization that her perfect world was crumbling around her. She looked like she was going to be sick, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the anger inside me was too strong, too consuming. This was what she deserved, this was the pain she had brought on herself. Without another word, I walked out of the party, leaving her there to deal with the fallout. As I left, I could hear the murmurs starting, could feel the eyes on my back, but I didn't care. I'd done what I came to do. I'd exposed her for what she really was, and now she would have to live with the consequences. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. I'd gotten my revenge, but it hadn't brought the closure I'd hoped for. The pain was still there, the betrayal still fresh. But at least now, everyone knew the truth. Melanie's perfect image was shattered, just like she had shattered our marriage. For the next few days, I kept my distance from her. She didn't try to talk to me, didn't try to explain or apologize. I think she knew it was too late for that. She spent most of her time in our bedroom, the door closed, the blinds drawn. I didn't care what she did, I was done with her. But as the days passed, I started to feel the weight of what I'd done. Yes, I'd made her suffer, but I'd also hurt myself in the process. Our kids, Amy and Jake, started to pick up on the tension in the house, started to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't understand what. How could they? How could I explain to them that their mother had betrayed me, that I had destroyed her in return? One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, Amy asked me, "Dad, are you and Mom mad at each other?" I paused, my heart aching at the innocent question. "Yeah, sweetheart," I said softly. "We're going through a tough time right now. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, we both love you and Jake very much." Amy looked at me with wide, worried eyes. "Are you going to get a divorce?" I hesitated, not knowing how to answer. "I don't know, Amy. We're still trying to figure things out. But I promise, no matter what, you and Jake will always be our top priority." She nodded, but I could tell she was still scared. I kissed her forehead and told her to get some sleep, but as I left the room, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. My anger at Melanie had blinded me to the fact that our actions, our decisions, were tearing our kids apart too. I had been so focused on revenge that I hadn't stopped to think about what this was doing to them. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had done. I had exposed Melanie, humiliated her in front of everyone we knew, and I had thought it would make me feel better. But it hadn't. If anything, it had only made things worse. In the quiet darkness of the night, I realized that revenge wasn't the answer. It hadn't brought me peace, hadn't healed the wounds that her betrayal had inflicted. All it had done was deepen the pain, both for me and for her, and for our kids, who were caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't understand. I knew then that I had to let go of the anger, the bitterness. I had to find a way to move on, for my sake, for Melanie's, and most importantly, for our children's. But I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know if it was even possible. All I knew was that the path I was on was leading nowhere, and if I kept going, I would lose everything that mattered to me. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I would talk to Melanie, not to hurt her, not to get revenge, but to try and find some way forward. I didn't know what that would look like, didn't know if our marriage could be saved, but I had to try. For the sake of our kids, if nothing else, I had to try. The next day, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The guilt of what I'd done to Melanie weighed heavily on me, but I knew I couldn't stop there. There was still one more person who needed to face the consequences of their actions, my wife's lover. The man who had helped destroy my marriage, who had thought he could step into my life and take what was mine without any repercussions. I had already beaten him to a pulp in that bar, but now it was time to hit him where it would hurt the most. I knew very little about him other than what I'd learned from snooping through Melanie's phone and emails. His name was Eric, and he worked as a real estate agent. He was good-looking, successful, and from the few photos I'd seen, he was the kind of guy who probably thought he was invincible. But what I found most interesting in my research was that Eric wasn't just some single guy playing the field. No, he had a wife, and from what I could gather, she had no idea what her husband had been up to. It didn't take long to find out more about Eric's wife. Her name was Emily, and she was a schoolteacher. They had been married for nearly 10 years, and they had 2 young kids. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family, just like Melanie and I had once seemed. But now I knew the truth. And just like my life had been torn apart, I was going to make sure Eric's life crumbled too. The first thing I did was gather all the evidence I had on Eric. I compiled everything, the text messages, the emails, the photos, into a neat little package. I wanted to make sure that when I made my move, there would be no denying what he had done. I knew this was going to hurt Emily, that it would devastate her just as much as it had devastated me, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She deserved to know the truth, just like I had deserved to know. And if it brought Eric down in the process, all the better. With the evidence ready, I decided to pay Emily a visit. I found out where she worked and planned to confront her after school, when she'd be getting ready to head home. I knew it would be a shock, that she wouldn't see it coming, but that was the point. Eric had blindsided me, and now I was going to do the same to him. That afternoon, I drove to the elementary school where Emily taught. I parked across the street and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure how this would go down, but I was determined to see it through. After what felt like hours, I saw her walking out of the school, carrying a stack of papers and looking like she was ready to start her evening at home with her kids. Little did she know that her world was about to be turned upside down. I got out of the car and approached her, calling her name as I got closer. She turned to look at me, confusion written all over her face. She didn't recognize me, of course, but that was about to change. "Emily?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" She hesitated, clearly wary of a stranger approaching her outside of work. "Do I know you?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "No," I admitted. "But you know my wife, Melanie." I saw the realization dawn on her face, the connection starting to form in her mind. "Melanie," she repeated, her voice trailing off as she tried to piece it together. "Wait. Eric's client?" My heart skipped a beat at the mention of his name, but I kept my expression neutral. "Yes," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm Jack, her husband. And I'm here because there's something you need to know about Eric." She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What is it?" she asked, her voice cautious. I handed her the envelope containing the evidence I'd gathered. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of what I was about to reveal. "But Eric and Melanie, they've been having an affair." For a moment, Emily just stared at the envelope in her hands, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all in there," I said, nodding toward the envelope. "The texts, the emails, the photos. I thought you should know the truth." She opened the envelope with trembling hands, pulling out the papers inside. I watched as she skimmed through them, her face draining of color as she realized that everything I was saying was true. I could see the devastation in her eyes, the same devastation I had felt when I first discovered Melanie's betrayal. "No, no, this can't be true," she whispered, shaking her head as if trying to will the truth away. "I'm sorry, Emily," I said, feeling a pang of guilt despite myself. "I know this is hard to hear. I've been through it too. But I thought you deserved to know." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked at me with a mixture of despair and anger. How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Months," I replied, my voice low. "I don't know exactly how long, but from what I've found, it's been at least a few months." She nodded slowly, as if trying to process the information. Then she looked down at the papers in her hands, her tears spilling over and running down her cheeks. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would he do this?" "I wish I knew," I said, feeling the weight of her pain. "But I don't have any answers. I'm just as lost as you are." For a moment, we stood there in silence, both of us reeling from the impact of Eric and Melanie's betrayal. I could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain that had been eating away at me for weeks. And in that moment, I realized that my need for revenge had been driven by the same hurt, the same need to make someone else feel what I had felt. But now, seeing the devastation I had caused, I wasn't sure if it had been worth it. Finally, Emily wiped her eyes and looked at me, her expression hardening with resolve. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm glad I know the truth, even if it hurts. I'm going to confront Eric tonight. He's going to have to explain himself." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of solidarity with her. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," I said softly. "If there's anything I can do, anything at all." She shook her head. "No, you've done enough. I appreciate you telling me the truth, but now I need to deal with this on my own." With that, she turned and walked away, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. I watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. Part of me felt satisfied that Eric was finally going to face the consequences of his actions, that his perfect little world was about to come crashing down. But another part of me felt hollow, as if the revenge I had sought had come at too high a cost. I got back in my car and drove home, my mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. I knew that when Emily confronted Eric, it would be explosive. He would be blindsided, just like I had been, and there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that. But I also knew that there was no going back from this. I had set something in motion that couldn't be undone, and the fallout would be brutal for everyone involved. When I got home, the house was quiet. Melanie was in the kitchen, her back to me as she prepared dinner. The smell of something cooking filled the air, but it didn't register with me. I stood in the doorway, watching her, wondering how we had gotten to this point, how everything had gone so wrong. She must have sensed me there, because she turned around, her eyes meeting mine. There was a wary look in her eyes, as if she was afraid of what I might say or do next. "Jack," she said quietly, her voice full of uncertainty. "Are you okay?" I didn't know how to answer that. Was I okay? I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that the anger I had been holding onto was slowly starting to slip away, leaving behind a numbness that I didn't know how to deal with. "Emily knows," I said flatly, watching her reaction. Melanie's eyes widened in shock. "What? How did she find out?" "I told her," I said, my voice cold. "I showed her everything." For a moment, Melanie just stared at me, her face pale. Then she closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "Oh God," she whispered. "What have you done, Jack?" "I did what I had to do," I replied, my tone harsh. "Eric deserves to face the consequences of what he did. Just like you." She opened her eyes, looking at me with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You don't understand, Jack. You've ruined everything." "No," I said, my voice hardening. "You ruined everything, Melanie. You and Eric. I'm just making sure you both pay for it." She looked like she was going to say something else, but then she just shook her head, turning away from me. I could see her shoulders trembling, could hear the sound of her quiet sobs as she tried to hold herself together. But I didn't feel any sympathy for her. Not anymore. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. That night, as I lay in the guest room, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to Emily, to the look of devastation on her face when I told her the truth. I had thought that revenge would make me feel better, that it would give me some sense of justice. But all it had done was spread the pain further, like a ripple effect that couldn't be stopped. I knew that Emily would confront Eric that night, and I wondered what he would say, how he would try to wriggle his way out of it. But I also knew that there was no escaping the truth now. The lies had been exposed, and there was no going back. The next morning, I woke up to find Melanie sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She didn't say anything when I walked in, just stared down at the cup of coffee in front of her. I poured myself a cup and sat down across from her, the tension between us thick and heavy. For a long time, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching on until it felt like it was suffocating us. Finally, Melanie broke the silence. "Eric called me last night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at her, waiting for her to continue. He said that Emily threw him out," she said, her voice trembling. "She found out everything. She told him she's filing for divorce." I nodded, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. "Good," I said simply. Melanie looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Jack, you don't understand. Emily is going to take everything. Eric is going to lose his family, his kids, his home, everything." I shrugged, not feeling an ounce of sympathy. He should have thought about that before he decided to fuck my wife. She flinched at my words, the harshness of them cutting deep. "But what about us, Jack? What about our family? What happens to us now?" I stared at her, feeling the weight of her question pressing down on me. What did happen to us now? Could we ever move past this, or was this the end? I didn't know the answer, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. "I don't know, Melanie," I said finally, my voice flat. "I honestly don't know." She nodded, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I know I've ruined everything. But I want to fix it. I want to try to make things right. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe there was still a chance for us. But after everything that had happened, after all the lies and betrayal, I wasn't sure if that was possible. The trust between us was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. We'll see, I said quietly, not committing to anything. Right now, I just need some time. She nodded, understanding. I'll give you all the time you need, Jack. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. But as I looked at her, all I could think about was how much damage had already been done. And I wasn't sure if time was enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on both of us, on our family, on everything we once had. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. Melanie and I continued to exist in the same space, but we were more like strangers now, two people bound by the remnants of a broken marriage, trying to navigate the ruins of what was once a life together. The silence between us was suffocating, filled with unspoken words, unanswered questions, and the weight of all that had gone wrong. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the office or locking myself in the guest room with my laptop. Anything to avoid facing the reality of what my life had become. Melanie, on the other hand, seemed to be trying to keep things together. She took care of the kids, kept the house running, and did her best to act like everything was normal. But we both knew it wasn't. The kids, bless them, were too young to fully understand what was happening. They sensed the tension, the changes in our home, but they didn't know the reasons behind it. I did my best to shield them from the fallout, to keep their lives as stable as possible, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't have the words to ask what. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkened street. Melanie was sitting at the table, a glass of wine in her hand, and I could feel her eyes on me. It was a familiar scene, one that had played out countless times over the past few weeks, but tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something needed to be said, that we couldn't keep going like this. Finally, I turned to face her, taking a deep breath. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but tired. Melanie looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "I know," she replied softly. "We can't keep living like this." I nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her. I wasn't sure where to start, how to even begin to address everything that had happened, but I knew we couldn't keep avoiding it. We had to face it, whatever the outcome might be. "Jack, I'm so sorry," Melanie began, her voice trembling. "I know I've said it 100 times, but I don't know how else to express how much I regret what I did. I've ruined everything, and I hate myself for it." I watched her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Melanie," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "I don't know if I even want to." She flinched, the pain in her eyes unmistakable. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to make things right, to fix this, if that's even possible." I shook my head, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "How do we fix this?" I asked, my voice raw. "How do we go back to the way things were? The trust is gone, Melanie. I don't know if we can ever get that back." She reached out to take my hand, but I pulled away, the gesture too painful to accept. "I know I've broken your trust," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "And I don't expect you to just forgive me and move on. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to try. I'll go to counseling, I'll give you space, I'll do anything. I just don't want to lose you, Jack. I don't want to lose our family." I looked at her, seeing the desperation in her eyes, the fear of losing everything. And in that moment, I realized that I was at a crossroads. I could continue down the path of anger and revenge, of holding on to the pain and letting it consume me, or I could try to find a way forward. But the truth was, I wasn't sure which path to choose. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Every time I see you, all I can think about is what you did, what you and Eric did behind my back." She nodded, her tears spilling over and running down her cheeks. "I hate myself for what I did," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do is try to make amends, try to show you that I still love you, that I'm still committed to our family. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Love isn't enough, Melanie. It's not just about love. It's about trust and respect, and all the things that hold a marriage together. And right now, I don't know if we have any of that left. She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping in defeat. What do you want to do, Jack? She asked quietly. Do you want to try to work through this, or do you want to end it? The question hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. It was the question I had been avoiding, the one I didn't want to answer because I didn't know if I could live with either outcome. But I knew I couldn't keep running from it. I had to make a decision, for my sake, for Melanie's, and for our children's. I don't know if we can work through this, I said honestly. But I'm willing to try. For the kids, if nothing else. Melanie looked up at me, hope flickering in her eyes. Really, she whispered. You're willing to try? I nodded, though it felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Yeah. But it's going to be a long road, and I don't know if we'll make it. I don't want to give you false hope. She reached out again, this time gently resting her hand on mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't return the gesture either. I'll take whatever chance you're willing to give me, she said, her voice filled with determination. I know it won't be easy, and I know I have a lot to prove, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you, Jack. I don't want to lose our family. I stared at her, searching her eyes for some sign that she was sincere, that this wasn't just another empty promise. And for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I had married, the woman who had been by my side for 15 years. But I also saw the cracks, the fractures that had formed in our relationship, the scars that might never fully heal. I'll try, I said finally, my voice heavy with the weight of the decision. But I can't promise anything, Melanie. I can't promise that things will ever be the same. She nodded, wiping away her tears. I understand, she said softly. I just want the chance to try. To prove to you that I can be the wife you deserve, the mother our kids deserve. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. But I also knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and setbacks. And there was no guarantee that we would make it to the other side. As we sat there in the dimly lit kitchen, the silence between us felt different this time. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of anger and resentment, but rather the quiet, uncertain silence of two people trying to figure out how to move forward. I knew that this was just the beginning, that there were still countless obstacles to overcome, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. That night, I moved back into our bedroom, though I kept my distance from Melanie. It was a small step, but it felt like a step in the right direction. We lay there in the dark, neither of us speaking, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I could feel her beside me, could hear the soft sound of her breathing, but it still felt like there was a chasm between us. As I stared up at the ceiling, my mind raced with thoughts of what the future might hold. I didn't know if we could ever truly mend the wounds that had been inflicted on our marriage, but I knew that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of anger and bitterness. I had to find a way to let go, to move forward, even if it meant walking a path I wasn't sure I could handle. The next morning, we sat down with the kids and had the conversation we had been dreading. We didn't go into detail, didn't tell them everything, but we explained that Mommy and Daddy had been having some problems and that we were going to work on fixing them. I could see the worry in their eyes, could feel the weight of their little hearts trying to understand what was happening. But we reassured them that no matter what, we both loved them more than anything, and that we would always be there for them. Over the next few weeks, Melanie and I started counseling together. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wanted to give up, when the anger and hurt threatened to overwhelm me. But I kept going, kept trying, because I knew that if there was any chance of salvaging our marriage, I had to be willing to put in the work. The sessions were intense, forcing us to confront the issues that had led to Melanie's affair, to dig deep into the cracks in our relationship. There were tears, arguments, moments when it felt like we were making progress and moments when it felt like we were back at square one. But through it all, I could see that Melanie was trying, that she was committed to making things right. Slowly, the walls between us began to come down. We started talking more, opening up to each other in ways we hadn't in years. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but it was a start. We were rebuilding, brick by brick, piece by piece, trying to create something new from the ruins of our old life. But even as we made progress, I knew that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. There were days when the doubt crept back in, when I questioned whether we were doing the right thing, whether we were just prolonging the inevitable. But then there were moments, small and fleeting, when I caught a glimpse of the love that had once brought us together, and I felt a glimmer of hope. In the end, I knew that whatever happened, we had to give it our best shot. For ourselves, for our kids, for the life we had built together. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were no guarantees, but it was a path we had chosen together. And that, in itself, was something worth fighting for. Months passed, and the days turned into a routine of counseling sessions, work, and trying to regain some semblance of normalcy at home. It wasn't easy, nothing about this situation was. There were days when the memories of Melanie's betrayal would resurface, bringing with them a wave of anger and sadness that threatened to pull me under. But I kept going, kept pushing forward, because I knew I had to for myself, for the kids, and even for Melanie. Counseling had become a crucial part of our lives. It forced us to confront the raw, uncomfortable truths about our marriage, about the years of neglect and emotional distance that had led us to this point. The therapist didn't let us hide from the difficult questions, and there were times when I wanted to walk out, when the pain of revisiting those memories felt too much to bear. But Melanie and I had made a commitment to each other and to our kids that we would see this through, no matter how hard it got. The kids, bless them, seemed to adjust to the new normal. They knew things were different, that their parents were going through something tough, but they didn't have the full picture. We made sure to keep their lives as stable as possible, maintaining routines and making time for family activities. There were moments of laughter and joy that reminded me why I was fighting so hard to keep our family together. But despite the progress we made in therapy, despite the moments of connection that hinted at the possibility of rebuilding, there was always a lingering doubt in my mind. Could we ever truly move past what had happened? Could I ever fully forgive Melanie, or would her betrayal always hang over us like a shadow, a constant reminder of what had been lost? One evening, after another grueling therapy session, Melanie and I sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken thoughts. The kids were asleep, and the house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. I could feel the tension in the air, the unasked questions that hung between us, and I knew we couldn't avoid them any longer. "Jack," Melanie said softly, breaking the silence. "We need to talk about what happens next." I nodded, knowing this conversation had been inevitable. "Yeah, we do." She looked down at her hands, fidgeting nervously. "I know we've been trying, that we've made some progress, but I can't help but feel like there's still this wall between us. Like no matter how hard we try, we can't quite get back to where we were." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You're right. There is a wall, Melanie. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to tear it down completely." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Do you think we're just prolonging the inevitable?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer right away, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I want to believe that we can rebuild, that we can find a way to move forward. But the truth is, I'm not sure if we can ever really go back to the way things were." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I hate that I've done this to us," she whispered. "I hate that I've destroyed what we had. But I love you, Jack. I still love you, and I want to keep trying, if you're willing." I looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, the love that was still there despite everything that had happened. But I also saw the pain, the guilt, the weight of the choices we had made. And in that moment, I realized that I had a choice to make, a choice that would determine the future of our marriage, of our family. "I love you too, Melanie," I said quietly. "But I don't know if love is enough anymore. The trust, it's broken, and I don't know if we can ever truly get it back. We've been trying, and I appreciate that, but maybe we're trying to fix something that's already too damaged." She looked down, her tears spilling over and running down her cheeks. "So, what are you saying?" I took a deep breath, the words heavy in my mouth. I'm saying that maybe it's time for us to let go, to stop trying to force something that might not be meant to last. She didn't respond right away, her sobs the only sound in the room. I could see the pain in her eyes, the heartbreak that mirrored my own. But I also saw a glimmer of understanding, a recognition that we had reached the end of the road. Maybe you're right, she whispered finally, her voice breaking. Maybe we've reached a point where we can't go back, where the damage is too deep. But I still want to do what's best for the kids, for us. If that means letting go, then maybe that's what we have to do. It was the hardest conversation I'd ever had, but it was also the most honest. We had tried to save our marriage, tried to find a way forward, but the truth was that too much had been broken. We had to face the reality that sometimes, love wasn't enough to fix what had been shattered. In the weeks that followed, we began the painful process of untangling our lives. We agreed to separate, to give each other the space we needed to heal. It wasn't an easy decision, and there were moments of doubt, of second-guessing, but deep down, we both knew it was the right one. We sat down with the kids and explained the situation as gently as we could. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, seeing the confusion and sadness in their eyes as we told them that Mommy and Daddy wouldn't be living together anymore. We reassured them that we both loved them, that we would always be there for them, but I could see that they were scared, that their world was changing in a way they didn't understand. After that, we began the process of dividing our assets, figuring out the logistics of co-parenting, and preparing for life apart. We worked with a mediator to ensure that the separation was as amicable as possible, that we both came out of it with a fair share and, most importantly, that the kids were protected. Melanie found a small apartment not far from the house, and we agreed that the kids would spend equal time with both of us. We were determined to keep their lives as stable as possible, to ensure that they knew they were loved and supported, even if their parents weren't together anymore. Moving day came sooner than I expected. Watching Melanie pack up her things, seeing the empty spaces in the house where her belongings used to be, was like ripping off a bandage that had never fully healed. The reality of our separation hit me hard, and I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions: sadness, relief, guilt, and a sense of finality. After Melanie left, the house felt eerily quiet. The absence of her presence was like a void, a reminder of everything that had changed. I wandered through the empty rooms, trying to come to terms with the fact that this was my new reality, that the life I had known for so long was over, and a new chapter was beginning. In the weeks that followed, I focused on creating a new routine for myself and the kids. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the loneliness felt overwhelming, but I knew that I had to keep moving forward. I threw myself into work, into spending time with the kids, and into the process of healing. Melanie and I remained civil, working together to co-parent as best we could. We attended counseling sessions separately, both of us trying to come to terms with the end of our marriage and to find a way to move forward. There were moments of tension, of hurt feelings and unresolved issues, but we made a conscious effort to keep the focus on the kids, to ensure that they were our priority. Slowly, as the weeks turned into months, the pain began to dull. The sharp edges of betrayal and anger softened, replaced by a sense of acceptance. I realized that while our marriage had ended, it didn't mean that our lives were over. We had both made mistakes, both caused each other pain, but we were still parents, still two people who had shared a life together. And while that life was no longer the same, it didn't mean we couldn't create something new, something different, but still meaningful. Melanie and I eventually found a new rhythm, a way to coexist as co-parents and, surprisingly, as friends. It wasn't easy, and it took time, but we both understood that holding onto anger and resentment wouldn't help anyone, least of all our kids. We made a conscious effort to communicate openly, to support each other in our roles as parents, and to ensure that our children felt secure and loved. As time went on, I started to rediscover parts of myself that had been lost in the turmoil of our marriage. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I had abandoned, and even started dating again. It was a slow process, and there were moments of doubt, but I found that the more I let go of the past, the more I was able to embrace the future. Melanie, too, began to rebuild her life. She found new passions, made new friends, and focused on creating a stable home for the kids. We kept our interactions positive and supportive, knowing that while our romantic relationship was over, our roles as co-parents would continue for the rest of our lives. One day, as I was picking up the kids from Melanie's apartment, I realized that I no longer felt the pain of our separation as acutely as I once had. There was still a sense of loss, of what could have been, but there was also a sense of peace, a recognition that we had both done our best, and that sometimes, things just don't work out the way you hoped. As I drove home with the kids in the back seat, chatting excitedly about their day, I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in a long time. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was okay. I had my kids, my health, and a future that was open and full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. In the end, Melanie and I made a decision that was best for everyone involved. It wasn't the outcome I had imagined when we first got married, but it was one that allowed us both to move forward with our lives. We had built something new out of the ashes of our old life, something that was different, but still had value. And as I looked in the rearview mirror at my kids, smiling and happy, I knew that we had made the right choice. We had given them the stability and love they needed, even if it meant letting go of the marriage we had once fought so hard to save. Life goes on, and so did we. It wasn't the fairy tale ending I had once envisioned, but it was real, and it was ours. And in the end, that was enough.